When the moon rises beyond the Atlantic shore of Florida, full and luminous, it seems so close that you could just row out to the end of the water and touch it. In January 1967, the moon seemed to draw nearer by the day to the hard, flat beaches of Cape Kennedy. Seen from there, it was no longer the governess of the tides, the lover's beacon, the celebrated mistress of song. It was a target, a Cold War beachhead in the sky. It was NASA's moon. Almost 6 years had passed since John Kennedy's challenge for a lunar landing by decade's end. The moon program had grown into an effort whose size and complexity dwarfed even the Manhattan Project. At aerospace contractors around the country, 400,000 people were hard at work on the moon ships for Project Apollo. Meanwhile, Project Gemini had just come to a spectacular finale. These two-manned missions had bridged the gap between the pioneering Mercury flights and the challenge of the lunar landing. For the first time in the race to the moon, the United States appeared to have pulled ahead of the Soviet Union. With the first manned Earth orbit Apollo flight scheduled for mid-February, all seemed on target to make Kennedy's vision a reality. But one evening, late in January, that soaring optimism suddenly and terribly fell to earth. How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between three buildings? Gus Grissom's voice was low and calm, but with an unmistakable edge of irritation. A senior astronaut veteran of 2 space missions, Grissom was the commander of the first manned Apollo flight set for February 1967. On this warm January afternoon, Grissom and his crew, veteran astronaut Ed White and a rookie named Roger Chaffee, were participating in a simulated countdown. The kind of routine test that preceded every mission. They were sealed inside the cone-shaped Apollo 1 command module, high atop a huge Saturn 1B booster rocket at Pad 34, one of dozens of launch complexes that lined the beach at Cape Kennedy. A few hundred yards away, inside the concrete bunker called the Saturn Blockhouse, some 200 members of the launch team heard Grissom's words. At the capsule communicator, or Stony, console, a young rookie astronaut named Stuart Rusa tried in vain to answer. Apollo 1, this is Stony. How do you read? In 1967, there were so many astronauts that Grissom and Rusa hardly knew each other, but the younger man could hear the barely contained exasperation in Grissom's voice. I can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ. I said, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings? No one knew Gus Grissom took him lightly. Small and powerful, he was known as a fierce competitor. Today's simulated countdown was nothing new. It wasn't considered dangerous. The Saturn booster was not fueled or even difficult. But there was trouble almost from the time Grissom and his crew climbed into the command module cabin about 1 p.m. First, there was an unidentified odor in the breathing oxygen that reminded Grissom of sour milk. That alone had held up the test for an hour. Finally, the problem was solved, and at 2:45 p.m., the pad crews installed the command module's heavy 2-piece hatch and sealed it shut. The spacecraft was pressurized with pure oxygen, just as it would be on launch day. Then came the communications trouble. By late afternoon, Russo was able to converse with the men inside the sealed spacecraft, but There were problems with the voice link to the manned spacecraft operations building 5.5 miles away. In the blockhouse, controllers weighed the decision of whether to abort the test. They decided instead to continue. In the blockhouse, seated next to Rusa at the stony console, Deke Slayton listened as technicians tried to fix the faulty communications. Slayton was 43 years old. He had been a civilian for several years now, but he still carried himself with the quiet, serious demeanor he'd had as a young Air Force fighter pilot. Another member of the original 7, Slayton was one of Gus Grissom's best friends, but their fortunes could not have been more different. Grissom was now a veteran of 2 space missions, while Slayton had been grounded since 1962 for a minor heart irregularity and was still waiting for his first chance to fly in space. Now, as chief of the Manned Spacecraft Center's Flight Crew Operations Directorate, Slayton's role included following astronauts through tests just like this one. Slayton knew only too well that Grissom wasn't happy with the way that things were going. He'd had breakfast with Grissom, White, and Chafee this morning, along with Joe Shea, the hard-driving NASA manager in charge of the command module effort, and they were all running through the litany of troubles with Grissom's spacecraft. Malfunctions in the environmental control system, coolant leaks, faulty wiring. Grissom bemoaned the communications trouble that plagued almost every test. "If you don't believe it," Grissom told Shea, "you ought to get in there with us." Shea declined, largely because there was some question about whether technicians would be able to rig up an extra communications headset for him in time. But Slayton gave the matter some thought. There would be space for him to sit in shirt sleeves in the command module's lower equipment bay beneath the footrests. He was still weighing the idea around midday as Grissom, White, and Chafee suited up. Slayton rode with him in the transfer van to Pad 34, and by the time they had arrived, he made his decision. He would be better off in the blockhouse, he told Grissom, where he could keep an eye on the test. Years later, he would still wonder whether or not he made the right choice. Within NASA, there was a disturbing lack of coordination. In Houston, some of the engineers in the Apollo program office acted as if Gemini had never existed. They had an arrogance that seemed to say, "We know this business better than you do." Experience from Gemini, Stafford's, or anyone else's seemed to make no impression on them. They rolled their eyes at those Apollo astronauts and their Gemini war stories. Trying to get through to them was like talking to a wall. All of them knew of the trouble with Block 1, but in the back of everyone's mind was the end-of-the-decade deadline for the lunar landing. However dissatisfied they were, Stafford and the other astronauts had been willing to put up with Block 1 for the first couple of flights in order to stay on schedule. Their feeling was, just get us airborne, we'll fly it. Suddenly, there was another message from the spacecraft, this time quite clear, in a voice of contained urgency. "We've got a fire in the cockpit." "We've got a bad fire. We're burning up." At first, Slayton thought it was pad leader Don Babbitt, stationed next to the spacecraft, calling for help. Later, on the tapes, listeners identified the voice as Chafee's.